Welcome to chapter 30 of the book of Genesis. This is one chapter I don't feel that I have the credentials to go through it correctly as I could because I'm not a woman, nor am I a rancher. But I'll do my best as we go through this. The first 2/3 of the chapter are about bearing children, and the last where we find out about animals bearing. Animals bearing, I don't think they don't call them children, with offspring. It begins, I'll read some Greek, and then we'll go into the chapter. Now, I'm going to use the English pronunciation for the names in this chapter. And Rachel, Idhusa de Rachel, Otiu tetoke to Yaakov. Ke azilo se Rachel tin adelphina aptis, ke ipe to Yaakov, thos mi tekna, ide mi televtiso ego. And Rachel saw that she has not borne to Jacob. And Rachel envied her sister Leah, who already had, 4 sons. So she goes to Jacob and says, "Give to me a child, and if not, I will come to an end." She's all upset, mad, or I'm not sure exactly what kind of mentality she has as not being a woman. If you're a woman out there, I'm sure you know how she felt. But it's interesting that she goes to Jacob to give him the child, but yet they know that God is the one that causes birth, brings about the birth process, but it doesn't have that. She's going to come to an end and commit suicide if she doesn't get what she wants. Sort of a lot of ways women manipulate men. And not that men don't manipulate women, but that's just one way. And how does Jacob react? Does he act real nice to her? No. Jacob was being enraged with Rachel, said to her, "I am not in place of God who deprived you of the fruit of the belly." So here I think we have the first argument between a husband and a wife, that the words are actually in print. And so instead of saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry, God will give you a child if it's in his will," in trying to comfort her, and instead he is enraged with her, gets mad, which we do a lot in people that are married and have been married, get mad at each other, and it's very typical. But it's not necessarily the best thing to do. It's not. And Rachel said to Jacob, "Behold, my maidservant Bilhah, Bala. Enter to her, and she will bear upon my knees. And even I will produce children from her." Sort of some type of a setup that they had in that generation of, if the women apparently didn't have a child that she had it through her maidservant, then it would be considered hers, maybe because of the ownership of a slave. And she gave Bilhah to him, her maidservant, to him as wife. And Jacob entered to her. So now he went to Leah, now he's going into Rachel's servant. And Bilhah, the maidservant of Rachel, conceived and bore to Jacob a son, another son. And Rachel said, not Bilhah, "God judged me and heeded my voice and gave to me a son through this one." On account of this, she called his name Dan. And Bilhah, the maidservant of Rachel, conceived again and bore a second son to Jacob. And Rachel said, "God aided me, and I was twisted by my sister, and I was able," probably reporting on how Leah made fun of her, and that how this rivalry between the sisters over the one husband. I could see where I would never want to have more than one wife. What a nightmare. And she called his name Naphtali. So that was the second child of Bilhah, the sixth son. And Leah saw that she stopped bearing, and she took Zilpah, her maidservant, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Now the third wife. Well, the marriage, multiple marriages were here, but that's not what God wants. He wants a man and a woman to be one. But the ideal and the allowed are two different things. God's ideal, but he allows other things to take place. Divorce, Jesus mentions how it was only given because of the weaknesses of the men, of the Jews at the time, but it wasn't originally the way it was. And 10, it continues and it says, and Zilpah, the maidservant of Leah, conceived and bore to Jacob a son. And Leah said, I am in good luck. And she named his name Gad, which probably means lucky. And some men were named lucky in my generation. And Zilpah, the maidservant of Leah, conceived again. I think that was about seventh there. And bore to Jacob a second son, which would have been, I think, the eighth. And Leah said, Blessed am I, for the women declare me happy. And she called his name Asher. Now, and this probably means happy, another name. And so he's having all these sons to now 3 women. And Reuben went in the day of the wheat harvest, so that was the firstborn. So after all these children are born here, is 7, so maybe he's like 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And he found apples of mandragoron in the field, a mandrake, and you can add that to your English derivatives book. And mandrakes were considered an aphrodisiac in those days, and they were a root plant, and they had sort of like it was like a tooth with the 2 parts going down, and the top of being the tooth, and then the 2 parts coming down. And I'm not exactly sure why they considered them aphrodisiacs, but they did. And he brought them to Leah, his mother. So apparently, if they found mandrakes, it was something good, because it was could help bring about childbirth. And Rachel said, now I said it was an aphrodisiac. It might have been just some type of a thing that they took and they thought it would help them become pregnant. I'm not exactly sure. You could probably look it up. Wikipedia and has, I'm sure it has a good article on mandrakes. And Rachel said to Leah, her sister, well, give to me of the mandrakes of your son. So she wanted to have a baby, so she's thinking those mandrakes are going to help the situation. And Leah said, well, it's not fit to you that you took my husband. Shall also you take the mandrakes of my son? So here another argument between the sisters, Leah blaming Rachel because Jacob loves Rachel more than her, and so forth. So now if you took my husband, you're going to take my mandrakes of my son? And Rachel said, well, no, not so. Let him go to bed with you this night, and that is Jacob, in return for the mandrakes of your son. So apparently they had turns. The man would come in and have different women. I don't know how they did it, way beyond my understanding, but it's an interesting story how they lived in those days. I'm sure to have multiple wives, you had to have a lot of money to be able to pull that one off. If you didn't, I think you'd be in big trouble with the wives, because they would demand a lot of things of you. In verse 16, and Jacob entered from out of the field at evening and came forth Leah to meet him and said, you shall enter to me today, for I have hired you in return for the mandrakes of my son. And so innocent Jacob having a hard day coming in and that, and maybe wanting to go to sleep and rest, and all of a sudden the wife comes out and says, you're chosen for me tonight. So maybe he was happy, maybe he wasn't, who knows. But he went to bed with her in that night. And God heeded Leah. And now Judah came through Leah, and Judah is where Jesus came through, so he didn't come through Rachel. And God heeded Leah, and conceiving she bore a fifth son, Jacob. And Leah said, God gave to me my wage, because of which I gave my maidservant to my husband. And that was before Bilhah. And she called his name Issachar, which is wage. And Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. And Leah said, God has presented to me a good gift in the present time. And my husband will select me for having borne to him 6 sons. Now, whether or not he did, I would imagine after all these years and these wives and these kids and everything, it probably was not a big deal to him, as you would be the first love when you're a young person when he first saw Rachel. And she called his name Zebulun. And after this, she bore a daughter, and she called her name Dinah. We'll hear about Dinah a little bit later here. And God remembered Rachel, and God heeded her and opened her womb. And conceiving, she bore to Jacob a son, and Rachel said, God removed from me the scorn, as Elizabeth and Sarah were sterile for a while. So here's something to see if you're listening to and reading this, that God can do miracles. So if you haven't had a child and you really want a child and you don't think you can have one, then ask God, and hopefully prayerfully that he would grant you your wish. And she called his name Joseph, saying, God added to me another son. Now, the other son would have been from her servant. I forgot the first one's name, Bilhah? Anyway, the first servant was Rachel's. And it came to pass when Rachel bore Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, well, send me that I may go forth into my place. He wants to go. Now, I'm thinking in unto my land, which was Canaan. Give to me my wives and my children for whom I have served to you, that I might go forth. So now the subject changes to the conflict between Laban and Jacob, which goes on for another chapter or two. For you know the servitude which I have served to you. And Laban said, well, if I found favor before you, could I foretell even that God blessed me in your entrance? You came, how would I know? You do so blessed. You draw your wage from me, and I will give it. And Jacob said to him, you know in what I served to you, and how much of your cattle was with me, for there was little, that's at the beginning, as much as was to you before me, and it was grown into a multitude. And the Lord, Kyrios, blessed you by my foot, his work, I suppose, a figure of speech. Walking and pasturing all these animals. Now then, when shall I also produce for myself a house? It be his property. And Laban said to him, well, what shall I give to you? And Jacob said to him, you shall not give to me anything. If you should do for me this word, I'm going to say again, I will tend your flocks and guard them. And here is what he asks, let all your flocks go by today. Now, again, as I said, I'm not a rancher. I don't know if you call or a shepherd. So I don't know how this all works out, but it works. It's in the Bible and it works out okay. And so then you let all your flocks today go by, and you part from there every gray sheep among the rams, and all white mixed and speckled among the goats. And it will be to me a wage. So he's getting the gray sheep and the rams, the males, and all white mixed and speckled among the goats, not the sheep. So it will be to me a wage. And my righteousness will take heed to me. God's going to do it in the next day. For my wage is before you, all whichever might not be speckled and white mixed among the goats and gray among the rams will be as stolen by me. So if there was any other kind of those rams and sheep, they're Laban's, and he will give them back to Laban. And Laban said to him, let it be according to your word. And he drew apart in that day of the speckled he-goats and of the white mixed, and all the goats, the speckled and the white mixed, and all gray, which was among the rams. Now, I hope you got that all straight. And he gave by the hand of his sons, them to take care of the animals, all the, I guess he has 11 now. And he left a journey of 3 days between them and between Jacob. So that's quite a distance, 3 days of journey where they lived. And Jacob tended the flocks of Laban, the ones left behind. Now, somehow these other ones, Jacob knew, and he's raising them. But it says, and Jacob took to himself a rod of green poplar. So we have a rod, and of walnut, and of the plane tree, apparently 3. And Jacob peeled them into white peels, tearing away the green, probably the green poplar. And there appeared upon the rods the white which he peeled, varying. Now, I'm guessing, not being a shepherd or a rancher, that what he's doing here is doing things that would make the male animal see this, and it would do something inside of him, which it happens to men. If you're a woman, you don't understand it, well, you probably never will. But if a man sees certain things, it can click inside of this brain, and he's thinking that this is the sexual organ. And so it gets him wanting to have sex. So because of what he's seeing. And looks like the back end of a ram, or not a ram, ram's a male, but the sheep. So he placed the rods at which he peeled. Now that's my guess. If I'm wrong, everybody thinks, oh man, this guy's really out of it. He's coming up with something that's really weird. Well, I hope I didn't. I hope this is what it's all about. And so he placed the rods which he peeled at the watering troughs of the channels of the water. So they had these channels where they poured the water from the well, that whenever the flocks should come to drink in front of the rods of those having come to drink, the animals, that they should stimulate the flocks at the rods. So it's just to stimulate them. And the flocks bore white mixed and colored and ashen speckled. And Jacob drew apart the lambs, maybe the white ones of Laban's, and he set a white mixed before the sheep, and every colored one among the lambs. And this is what I'm saying. This really gets confusing. If you're a shepherd, you may know exactly what this is all about. And he parted to himself flocks for himself, and he did not mix them into the flocks of Laban. So now Laban's flocks, and then he has his own. So his own are having all these, he's stimulating, and they're having more and more and more, where the other ones aren't being stimulated, and they're having not as many. That's what I'm guessing. And it came to pass in the time in which the flocks stimulated in the womb. So now that would make it a female. So maybe and I'm thinking it was a male because I'm a male, but maybe a female, something there. I don't know. You figure it out. Help, help, help. And Jacob taking them, put the rods before the flocks at the watering troughs for the purpose of stimulating them by the rods. But whenever the flocks bore, he did not place them. And the unmarked became Laban's and the marked Jacob's. So anyway, we're getting a lot of animals here. And the man became rich exceedingly, exceedingly, that is Jacob. And there was to him much cattle, and oxen, and men servants, and maid servants, camels, and donkeys. But it's not the end of the story between Jacob and Laban. We'll find out what happens next in chapter 31, which I hope you join us in. And till then, God bless.